I have the right to keep it under my wing and present it here as a kind of lost treasure of Canadian cinema, of queer cinema. I first saw this film in 1974 at its premiere at the Whitney Museum in New York City. And I loved the film, and I'd never seen anything like it, and I don't think I have since. All the more so since Frank Vitale, the director of the film, the star of the film, the scriptwriter, was so my type in 1974. Michael plaid shirt. In my gay Marxist study group, we would call them proletarian butches. Anyway, he was really hot, and my love affair with this film and with Frank has lasted 35 years. I can't believe I'm saying this, 35 years. Where has the time gone? But I think it's important to remember our history. It's so exciting that this festival does have this series of reviving classics, because without a sense of our history, I think we don't understand the present and where we're going in the future. Okay, Montreal, Maine is characterized by the Dictionnaire du Cinéma Québécois, the Quebec Film Encyclopedia, as being a falling star film, a kind of flash in the pan without ancestors or descendants. It's anomalous, it's unique, it didn't really fit into some kind of a tradition or doesn't really have a legacy. And that's why it's so important to recapture that moment and these images in many ways. And it's so important that this film has been restored by my colleagues at Concordia, Dave Douglas and Peter Rist. The restoration project was funded by the Audiovisual Trust, part of Canadian Heritage. And guess what? The Tories, you folks out here in Western Canada, re-elected, canceled this very important funding project, and so no more restorations of archival Canadian films, I'm sorry to say, for this reason. Yes. So maybe looking at last night's film, Portside, another aspect of this festival's historic consciousness reminds us how important it is to think about history, not only history of what's on the screen, but history of our spaces and our geographies. I'd like to thank also my publishers who are here tonight, Robert and Brian from Arsenal Pulp Press, because we are... my collaborator, Jason, and I are co-writing a book on this film, which will come out late next year with Arsenal Pulp Press as part of the Queer Film Classics series. So here's a chance, I think, not only to reuse and recycle and re-see this film, but also to read about it, the context and its importance. Now, I realized there was a little bit of a mistake in my framing of this film to the media. I used the word masterpiece too often, so I think your expectations are at a fever pitch. I just want to, as I said, calm you all down. This is a beautiful, subtle, modest, small-scale movie. And like most Canadian films, it sort of grows on you. It's not the Transformers. I think it does have a kind of transformative impact. 2 years after I saw this wonderful, subtly modest film at the Whitney Museum, I moved to the very neighborhood that it was about, Montreal's main neighborhood, the St. Lawrence Boulevard, the Plateau, and recognized everything and acquired a kind of sentimental personal ownership over this film and the spaces, the countercultural, the queer, the bohemian spaces that it celebrates. And as I said, I first wrote about it in a kind of survey of Quebec queer cinema, or what we called then lesbian and gay cinema, in 1980 and saw it as a kind of real pioneering work that had not been replicated in any way, as they said, a kind of falling star, maybe a rising star. But anyway, that's sort of a segue into its Canadianness. As you all know, Canadian films struggle against an impossible distribution and exhibition situation. Only 2% of our films make theatrical screens, especially in English Canada. But when we do chance upon them, when we do see them, there's this magic of recognition. Our spaces that we see that Hollywood just can't capture. And that's one of the virtues of this film. There's a wonderful fight scene in this film towards the end of the film that takes place in Schwartz's, the Jewish delicatessen, just around the corner from where we live. And it's just wonderful to see that place. It's now called Charcuterie Hébraïque Schwartz. Is that right? Did I get that right? Something like that, yeah. And it's wonderful to see this thing back in 1973 when the film was made. That's something we can't see in the imported cinema. It's real Canadian content, to use a kind of cliche term. And in fact, the makers of the film even have a kind of tongue-in-cheek attitude towards Canadian content. They don't send the characters out paddling in a canoe to a loon's cry, as I've seen in other films, but at a certain moment, one of the characters wears a maple leaf toque, and it's just sort of a wink at the Canadian content. After all, the film, like virtually every other film made in Canada, is funded by the state. And this was one of the early films funded by what we then called the Canadian Film Development Corporation, that turned into Telefilm Canada a few years later. I don't know who read the script, but there was a sort of a laid-back feeling, I think, in the 1970s, and they were funding a lot of first-time films by directors no one had ever heard of. This was really the golden age of first film auteur Canadian cinema, and Frank Vitale, the director, certainly bought into that. He had already got involved with another state-funded enterprise called Videograph, which was a department of Challenge for Change, which was an activist documentary program at the National Film Board of Canada, which only lasted a decade, but a chapter of Canadian film history that is really under-recognized and needs to be celebrated. With this wonderful new Portapac video equipment, Frank and the others who made the film did a video run-through workshopping of their script ideas, and all the characters improvised their parts, and I think it was this that the funders saw before they gave them their budget. So in many respects, it's a success story for state funding that the Tories have their eyes on, but haven't yet managed to kill, thank God, for the Northern governments. It comes out of left field in a certain way. It's not a gay liberation movie in any sense of the word. It was made by this little cluster of bohemian, countercultural artist types living in those cheap lofts on the Main. They were McGill students. They loved movies. They probably met John Grierson in his film courses at McGill in the early 70s. And they just were obsessed and pulled off a couple of films before they disappeared from film history. I think Canadian cinema in general has this second or third film syndrome. People make a great first film, a promising and pioneering first film. When the second one comes out, the critics are waiting with sharpened teeth, and very often there's never a third film. So Frank Vitale and his collaborators very soon disappeared from the Canadian film landscape.